But we're told by Rishi Sunak, front pages of every sort of paper, we are entering a dangerous new era. He says he's going to make a landmark speech today to spell out the challenges of three things: AI, migration and authoritarian states. And I thought, who better to talk about these things than you? We talk about migration and immigration all the time. We talk about authoritarian states. I presume he's talking about Russia. He's talking about places presumably in the Middle East. He's talking about China. What's it all about?
Well, the first thing to say is once the Tories have an election coming up, it's time to roll out Project Fear. That's the first thing to say about this. So we have to, of course, bear that in mind.
Yeah. Let's unlock that cupboard. What's in there for us today?
But that being said, yeah, there's much truth to what he said. We are going into a very dangerous time in the, as you say, migration and AI and the threat from authoritarian states are all there. But they've been there for the past 14 years.
Yes.
And the idea that you want to put trust in the Tories to get a control of international migration, I think if you voted for Tory in 2010 and then in 2014 and then 2017, 2019, you know, what did Einstein say? Insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result.
To be fair, they kept saying that they were going to bring migration levels down to sort of 20,000 a year, didn't they? Which has been a complete and utter bald-faced lie every single time.
Well, it was going to be brought down to the tens of thousands, that's right, in the first two elections. And of course, what do we now have? We have a gross migration of 1.2 million per year, far worse now than under New Labour and under Tony Blair. You know, I mean, we have 42% of the 10 million foreign-born people living in this country arrived within the last decade.
This is a wonderful statistic of yours, which I've heard you say before, that much more of the immigration, or the great bulk of it, has happened in recent years.
We had more immigration last year than in the entire decade of the 1980s and the 1990s. We had 20 years of immigration last year, and yet Rishi Sunak says, don't worry, I've got a plan. And he actually says, I have some bold ideas. Well,
really?
Well, better late than never. I mean, where have you been for the last decade?
But also, the thing about some of the things he's going to say, and we always get fed these lines before he actually says them, he's going to say that he feels a profound sense of urgency. Oh, really? You know, 14 years later, he says that Britons will see almost every aspect of their life changing. Well, surely somebody in Downing Street could have seen this coming before now, before it suddenly got to critical mass.
Exactly. We're in literally the final weeks of before a general election, if it's going to come at the end of the year. And the idea that you're now suddenly going to bring out all of these policies, and of course it's very easy to come out and say, well, we're going to increase spending on defence to 2.5%, when you know full well you're not going to be in power long enough to actually see any of these policies coming into fruition. So as we always see with the Tories when they come up to a general election, they begin to throw red meat out to the voting public, and they get those you know, red top tabloid headlines that they want to get. And unfortunately, in recent years, the public have fallen for it. However, I think they've actually run out of steam on this one, and there's very little chance of this sort of scaremongering working. Nevertheless, the fact is Russia and China are doing what they're doing because the West, Britain and America, have been perceived to be far too weak and ineffectual. It's no surprise that when Donald Trump was president, Putin wasn't making any inroads into Ukraine. You weren't having saber rattling by China over Taiwan, and it's because of the perceived weakness of Biden. It's because of the perceived weakness of the EU that we do have states like Russia and China doing what they're doing. You know, as Teddy Roosevelt said,
and doing what they like, effectively.
Teddy Roosevelt was right. The President of America, speak softly and carry a big stick.
Yes.
You know, strong, self-confident nations are assertive. And when the West was really dominant in the world, in the era, even with Thatcher and Reagan, it's because we knew who we were. We had clearly defined values and principles, and we were prepared to enforce those and spend the money on our defense budgets. And that's how we tackled communism. That's how we tackled fascism. And there's no surprise that as the West declines, that we have lost the ability to actually stand up and assert ourselves.
And if you ever wanted to see, in a sort of a visual form, the decline of the West, you could have watched the Eurovision Song Contest on Saturday night. I didn't. I sort of dipped in and out because I thought, I know I'm going to have to be talking about this. But what an absolute nonsensical show it's now become. You know, and lots of people was commenting over the course of the last couple of days how it's gone full circle now, from exploiting women supposedly to now sort of, you know, sexualising men. Men sort of walking around as if they've come out of some bondage S&M club.
Yeah, this is the most bizarre thing, not just with Eurovision actually, but if you watch television now, you'll barely ever see a nude female.
Right.
But nude males are on full display
all
at
over
all
the
times.
place. Yeah.
Full frontals you'll get on Netflix and so forth. But yes, I mean, you know, Eurovision was something which was really family viewing for decades.
Right. It was cheesy and it was kind
cheesy,
of, you know...
But now, the amount of gratuitous sexual content, the eroticism and everything else, completely inappropriate for that time zone, for that time of day. And, you know, also, but you have to ask, why do the British keep putting themselves through this annual ritual of humiliation?
Yes,
you know,
exactly right.
Britain has got the second greatest musical record in the world after America in terms of its global influence as a music-producing country. We are par excellence.
But we managed to produce
and yet somehow we get Ollie Alexander out of all of this, performing in the loo at the YMCA. It seemed
absolutely incredible. And of course, you know, it also had the added dimension of the you know, the ban on this projected ban on Israel taking part and all these ridiculous demonstrations outside about Palestine. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure. One interesting thing that I did see yesterday, and I think we may be able to have a look at it, is David Cameron appeared on Laura Kuenssberg's show, and I said this actually yesterday at the time on Twitter. Amazingly, the BBC think that Gaza is the biggest story in Britain. It isn't, right? But they spent the first 20 minutes of a show called, you know, which is the main sort of morning news show, talking about nothing but Gaza. But the only time when she decided, Laura, to change the subject was after David Cameron said this.
When you see what Hamas are prepared to do, you just realise the terrible, dreadful, inhuman people, frankly, that we are dealing with. And maybe it's a moment, actually, for the BBC to ask itself again, should we describe these people as terrorists? They are terrorists. If you kidnap grandmothers, you kidnap babies, you rape people, you shoot children in front of their parents, what more do they need to do for the BBC to say, look, these are terrorists? They really are.
And that was actually one of Cameron's finest moments since in his latest incarnation. He really put Laura Kuenssberg on the spot. Of course, she didn't answer the question. She moved on to Ukraine.
Yeah, no, typically, I mean, actually, it was one of the few times, actually, I thought Cameron did a superb job, particularly because he's actually been quite strong on opposing Israel in the past.
Yes, he has.
When he was Prime Minister and so forth. So very reassuring to see him say this. And yes, put the BBC on the spot. And the fact that they still aren't willing to call this barbarous organisation, Hamas, terrorist, I think speaks volumes to the mentality that's existing there. You saw everyone from John Simpson and others coming out, putting these spirited defences of why it can't be called a terrorist organisation.
It's all to do with impartiality and the safety of journalists. No, it isn't.
No,
it just isn't.
When you see the atrocities that they've done, and when you see this recent video that they put up of this poor guy whose family want him to come home and now being told that he's been killed, I mean, this is callous stuff that's being seen. And the BBC, of course, yet again refused to acknowledge their own failings, and as you say, eager to change the subject when it comes to their own failings.
Very much so. And yet again, you might not be surprised to know that Gary Lineker has got himself into a bit of hot water because he gave an interview to Mehdi Hassan, who was fired, of course, from his job in America because of his inability to be unbiased. He's now got his own show, I think, on YouTube. Gary Lineker does an interview with him in which he refers to that Hamas thing. Have a look at this.
I can't think of anything that I've seen worse in my lifetime. The constant images of children losing their lives day in, day out. Now, obviously, we all know what, you know, October 7th happened and, you know, the Hamas thing. But the minute you raise your voice against what they're now doing there, you know, you get accused of being a supporter of Hamas or, you know, all this kind of stuff. It's not anti-Semitic to say that what Israel is doing is wrong. And I just can't see how everybody doesn't see it that way now. For, you know, whatever the cause, whatever started it, and we all know that, you know, the history of this area of the world goes way before October the 7th. But it's truly dreadful what's happening, and I cry on a regular basis when I see certain images on social media.
He cries on a regular basis.
I wonder if he cried on October the 7th.
Well, apparently it was the Hamas thing on October the 7th. That's what we all know about, the Hamas thing.
Well, this is the problem here. Well, firstly, the fact that he chose to go on to Mehdi Hassan's show tells you a lot,
yes.
because a more disingenuous host of a show I can't think of, particularly on this topic.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, the message is the same. Whether it's anybody on the left or Lineker, they cannot bring themselves to condemn Hamas.
No.
They're embarrassed by it. They will skirt over the issue, and they will have all focus on the fact that Israel is trying to basically protect its people. And you get this argument, well, you know, why was Russia banned from Eurovision whereas Israel wasn't? Because Israel wasn't the aggressor here.
Right.
This is the fact people don't seem to realise, you know. This was an attack on Israel, and people like Gary Lineker and others simply can't bring themselves to condemn
And once
anything.
again, the BBC will be doing sort of, you know, flip-flops and all sorts of handsprings to try and get out of the fact that this is okay because it wasn't on social media. So they'll say, oh, he hasn't breached the BBC guidelines, which is what they said when he wrote a letter, do you remember? Except that it is all over social media because Hassan has obviously put the clip out and everybody's seen the clip over and over again over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean...
But he won't be sanctioned for it, will
The
he?
BBC are a paper tiger when it comes to all this. I mean, how many more times does he have to actually break the code and the charter before things happen? I think it's just clear now that he's got no intention of following what he agreed to do.
Of course not. And he now runs a podcast company which publicises and publishes an awful lot of political podcasts. Now, I'm not suggesting that he shouldn't be allowed to do that. But again, you know, they all tend to be of one particular persuasion. It's not as if he's got a conservative podcast. He doesn't have one of those. But for those of you who worry about Gary Lineker weeping into the night, you can also have a whole list of things that he doesn't weep about. Let's see. Yazidi women and girls kidnapped, raped, abused and sold by ISIS. Boko Haram kidnapping and abusing girls. Saudis bombing Yemen for 7 years. Nigerian Islamists killing Christians. Countless crimes against Hindus and Christians in Pakistan. And the systematic rape of English girls by many Pakistani gangs here. You know, there are lots of things he could keep himself up at night weeping about.
Well, forget the weeping. It would be nice if you could actually mention them once in a while, right? Just a simple little tweet about any of those issues would provide some balance. But yeah, I mean, look, all of those marches that we see every Saturday, you know, was there a single march about the Syrian leader murdering his own people? Was there a single march in London about the Iranians suppressing women's rights and murdering people brutally in Iran? Was there anything about Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, which the UN condemned as a war crime against children?
No.
None at all.
Amazingly.
The hypocrisy is just staggering.
Absolutely right.